Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over the presidency and the bureaucracy. I'm sure this is everyone's favorite, so let's dive right in here. All right, four main objectives in today's lecture. We're gonna define the functions and characteristics unique to the American bureaucracy. We're going to describe some of the influences on the federal bureaucracy, and then we're going to compare and contrast the roles of the cabinet departments and the executive office of the president. That's probably going to be the main focus, the idea between, what's the difference between the White House Chief of Staff and the Secretary of State. So understand the dynamics of the relationship that these individuals have with the president. And then we're going to discuss some of the common complaints about the bureaucracy. So what is the bureaucracy? The bureaucracy is basically a systematic way of organizing a complex and large administrative structure. So each president, they're going to deal with the bureaucracy in a different manner. So what new president comes into office will definitely have an effect on how a bureaucracy is run. So again, it really depends on the personal style of each president. But one thing is for certain. The single largest employer in the United States is the federal government. So it's a huge bureaucracy, and as such, there are a lot of different facets to this bureaucracy. Again, generally divided into four basic types. You have cabinet departments, independent executive agencies, independent regulatory agencies, and government corporations. So there are four different types of general types of how bureaucracy is divided into. So you have the cabinet departments, independent executive agencies, independent regulatory agency, and then you have government corporations there. So what are the cabinet departments? There are 15 departments. The most recent being Homeland Security. It was created in 2002, in response to the September 11th attacks. So they're originally only a handful, but there are 15 different executive departments, and some of the ones we'll go over all the specific ones, but couple ones that stand out. You have the Department of State, headed by John Kerry. Originally, it was Hillary Clinton's job under Obama. Defense, which is actually headed by a Republican, Chuck Hagel. Obama actually appointed a Republican, which, presidents will generally choose members of his or her own party, but once in a while, president will tap a member of the opposing party to be Secretary of Defense or something along those lines. And Attorney General Eric Holder. Again, these are, more prominent cabinet level positions. Again, the head is appointed by the president, but subject to Senate confirmation. So you see separation of powers, the president appointing, and the Senate is confirming. But again, there's some checks and balances. The president can't just appoint anyone to the cabinet. Again, these are high profile positions, usually right when the president, right when the president is deciding a lot of different things. Cabinet level positions, they probably rank as being one of the more important things that a president does in regards to his or her administration. Again, there's some independent executive agency, and these are very similar to departments, but they don't have the cabinet level status. So these independent executive agencies, again, they're subject to Senate confirmation, but they don't have that type of cabinet level status. And then there are independent regulatory agencies. So this was created to regulate apart from the executive. The whole idea of this is to give the regulating board separate authority apart from the president. For example, the SEC, they regulate things regarding Securities and Exchange Commission. The Federal Reserve Board. Recently, President Obama actually appointed Janet Yellen to be the first female to head the Federal Reserve Board. So she's the chairman. chairman of the Fed. Again, that's a fairly significant position, and again, it's a position that's subject to Senate confirmation, but again, the president decides, and usually the Fed chairman no longer is really beholden. It's not really working for the president anymore, working for the interests of the American public. And then you have government corporations, and what they do, they carry out business-like activities, so they're trying to generate profit. You have the Tennessee Valley Authority, United States Post Office, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So the problem with these these government-like corporations, if you take a look at the United States Post Office, they don't really do a great job in turning a profit, partly because it's not run like a private company. So even though their goal is to make profit, there's not really as much of a drive for the post office to make profit as there would be with a company like FedEx or UPS. But again, these are basically the 4 different ways that our American bureaucracy is actually divided into. So what are some characteristics of the American bureaucracy? Well, political authority is shared, and that's going to be a common theme, the idea that no one individual actually controls the bureaucracy by both the president and Congress, and most agencies share functions with similar agencies in state and local governments. So you can actually use bureaucracy as an example of how power is divided within the national government. So that's the idea that there's a lot of shared powers between the executive and legislative, but also on a federal level. So what the national government does, there's some redundancy or there's some cooperation, depending on how you look at it, between states and the national government. So there's an example of federalism in action there. So no one entity really controls the bureaucracy. It's one of those things where everyone has a little bit of say, and the benefit in that is no one person really controls it. The downside, obviously, is something goes awry, then it's hard to really pinpoint the blame on either Congress or the president, or again any individual entity, because there's so much shared accountability. The reason why bureaucracy actually has a lot of power, though, is the main source of bureaucratic power comes from its discretionary authority. Okay, what that means is the following. So Congress describes what gets done. So Congress can enact a law. This agency must carry out so and so, but they're vague in what has to be done in order to carry this out. And so these bureaucracies, they have a lot of discretionary authority as to how to carry out the will of Congress. So again, Congress describes what gets done, but the agency may create specific regulations that are in accordance with these congressional mandates. So this gives these bureaucracies incredible amounts of authority. The IRS, for example, there are a lot of different things that the IRS can do in terms of doing what its mandate is in terms of collecting taxes. So the head of the IRS, they can create a lot of there's a lot of leeway in how the head of the agency can run the organization. So again, Congress has general mandates, and again, the head of each bureaucratic organization, they pretty much get to decide a whole lot of things. So they have a lot of discretionary authority. Now, again, some agencies deal directly with the American public, like I mentioned, everyone's favorite agency, the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, while other agencies work with state and local governments. And so individuals don't really contact them. They work in conjunction with state and local organizations like the Department of Education. Now, what are some main influences on the federal bureaucracy? So we're going to pinpoint 3 here. So there's executive influences, there's congressional influences, and then iron triangle. We'll discuss what this iron triangle actually means here. So you have these 3 different influences on the federal bureaucracy. So executive influences. Well, again, the president appoints people. Again, that's something that the executive has power over in a lot of areas. So that's basically the main thing. The president's ability to select an individual that's going to head a bureaucratic organization. And again, the president can issue executive orders in which it is basically the responsibility of these bureaucracies to follow the mandate of the president via the executive order. And again, I mentioned before, it's really is the personality of the president to actually reorganize different agencies according to his personal managing style. Okay. And then you also have congressional influences. So whereas the president actually makes appointments, there's Congress that they influence the appointments. They're going to hold hearings. There's every individual is going to be scrutinized, again, depending on the level of a bureaucracy, high level versus low ranking. High level officials are going to be subject to greater scrutiny. And again, they're going to write legislation impacting agencies, which again, agencies have a lot of discretionary power, but again, it's these congressional influences that dictate what these bureaucracies are going to actually do. And this is where the iron triangle might exist. So this is in regards to like a bureaucracy, a congressional committee, and interest group. So these three corners of the iron triangle, they're going to basically wield a lot of power in terms of how these relationship structures and how things actually get done in Congress. So let's see, these alliances, these iron triangles. First part would be the bureaucracy. Okay. Second part would be the interest groups. Again, the goal of an interest group the goal of an interest group is to basically figure out what legislation is going to impact its members positively, and so they're going to work with the bureaucracy to try to get favorable legislation passed, or they're going to do what they can to basically lobby these congressional committees. Okay, so one example might be a bureaucracy might be dealing with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and then an interest group might be like the NRA, and then the congressional committee could be a committee dealing with firearm regulations, something along those lines. So there's going to be a lines. There's going to be individuals that work closely in each of these three arenas. And again, there's probably a chance there's a lot of cozy relationships that take place within this alliance. And so some people think that that's just the way Washington gets done, where individuals are going to be within that iron triangle. So if you're outside that sphere, you're not going to really have too much power. And again, it's not necessarily always bad. Congress and the president oftentimes defer to their influence simply because they're the experts. The NRA, they're going to have all the information regarding statistics and all these different things, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, they're going to be they're going to be filled with individuals that have experience in that arena. And then these congressional committees, they're going to have a lot of experience, passing laws and legislation regarding firearms. So again, that's just one example. As far as the AP test is concerned, just make sure the number one priority is to understand you have the bureaucracy, you have the interest group, and you have the congressional committees all working together towards passage of legislation. Now again, there's a lot of revolving door effect where individuals from the interest groups, they exit and they enter the bureaucracy. They're former Congress members that end up lobbying. There are actually some ethics rules. If you leave Congress, I believe there's a year waiting period of time before you can enter into an industry, so that you can't directly benefit from having worked with certain interest groups. But there's a lot of individuals, they wait that year or take on roles that aren't directly in regards to lobbying. So there are ways that that former congressmen can get paid or benefit basically from their time in Congress. So again, former Congress members might have lucrative private sector jobs awaiting them upon leaving the public sector. For example, former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle started his own consulting firm. And again, as such, there's a lot of influence that I'm sure he is familiar with, and having that experience, it definitely helps him out. Again, another individual, J.C. Watts, he ended his congressional career, in the mid '90s, and he was able to parlay his experience and exit and get into lobbying. So one of the destinations a lot of these congressmen go towards after their political careers are over are basically into these interest groups. And again, if you go into that field, you're going to have a lot of influence and you're going to have built a lot of relationships with fellow congressmen. So it becomes a very convenient arrangement for a lot of these politicians. Now, the executive office of the president, what the heck is that? This was actually established in 1939. Again, each president relies on different agencies depending on preference. So President Franklin Roosevelt, he basically reorganized the office, making the White House office a little bit more fully staffed, so to speak. Prior to FDR, there wasn't as much of a systematic way of organizing the White House staff. So the executive office of the president was created again to basically fill the roles that's basically required for the presidency, being such a demanding role. And again, some key agencies would be the White House office, National Security Council, and then the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. And so these are just three different examples of the executive office of the president. Now, the White House office, this is basically where, if you watch a lot of movies really dealing with the president, for example, Dave. The movie, the premise of Dave is a movie in which President Bill Mitchell suffers a stroke, and there's a body double that basically assumes the role of the presidency. Well, there are two key members of Bill Mitchell's staff that are in on this conspiracy, and they're basically part of the White House office. You have the chief of staff, whose main loyalty is to the president of the United States. You have the chief of staff, and then you have the press secretary. So you have certain positions that basically their primary goal is loyalty to the president. They're basically an extension of the president. So a lot of these presidential movies, they kind of highlight this reality that the White House office, they're there to serve the president. Whereas we'll discuss about cabinet members, that's not necessarily the case. But with the White House office, the number one goal is to serve the president of the United States. And your interests are basically aligned with that of the president's, which is not necessarily the case with cabinet level officials. Again, in theory, it really should be, but the nature of the job might dictate otherwise. So again, White House office personal and political staff members include the chief of staff, counsel to the president, and press secretary. Another popular TV series, The West Wing. The West Wing basically details the daily happenings of what it's like in the White House office. You're not going to see a whole lot of cabinet members. Cabinet members, they have their own issues. They're basically leaders of their own bureaucratic organizations, whereas the White House staff, again, their primary objective is to serve the President of the United States. You have the National Security Council. Basically, the NSC, they advise the President on security concerns, both domestic and foreign. Probably two of the most notable National Security Council advisors were probably Henry Kissinger and Condoleezza Rice. Now, incidentally, some of the duties of the job actually overlap with that of Secretary of State. And interestingly enough, Henry Kissinger actually ended up becoming Secretary of State, as did Condoleezza Rice. So Again, it really depends on the president whether the president is going to rely more on the advice of the NSC or Secretary of State. It's really up to the president's governing style. And then you have the Office of Management and Budget. Again, their job is to help the president craft an annual budget, which is again subject to Senate confirmation, which is one of the few positions that is subject to Senate confirmation, because Chief of Staff, Press Secretary, a lot of these offices within the EOP, they are not subject to Senate confirmation, but the OMB is. And finally, most staff, again, not subject to Senate confirmation, and again, they tend to maintain loyalties to the president more so than the heads of cabinet departments. And why is this? And as I explained, if you are the chief of staff, your goal is to manage the day-to-day affairs of the President of the United States. If you're the Secretary of Defense, your job is to manage the day-to-day affairs, or you're basically almost like the president of a huge organization, employees of a couple 100,000. And so your job is to manage them and set rules and dictate standards. And sometimes it can become at odds with the goals of the president. Again, so the key or the three original departments, you had the State Department, 1789, the Treasury, 1789, and you had Defense, 1789 as well. And you also had the not actually a secretary position, but you had the Attorney General as well. But the Secretary of State, what do? The Secretary of State advises the president on foreign policy, negotiates treaties, represents the United States abroad. So you're going to log a lot of frequent flyer miles if you're the Secretary of State. And so there's going to be a lot of diplomatic things that are required of the Secretary of State. Now, normally, the Secretary of State in modern times has not been a stepping stone to the presidency. The exception being, again, Hillary Clinton was Obama's Secretary of State. Interesting, had she been the vice presidential candidate, it might have been a situation that could have worked, but Hillary Clinton was offered the Secretary of State position. And again, she's seen as a possible leading contender for the presidency in 2016. So it's not without precedent for a Secretary of State to make the jump to the presidency. Again, obviously, there's all these other positions. For example, John Kerry. John Kerry used to be a senator from Massachusetts, presidential candidate in 2004, and became the Secretary of State under Obama's administration. Probably not a future presidential candidate, but this is a very prominent position. Probably one of the most, if not the most prominent secretary cabinet level position. And again, Colin Powell. Colin Powell never actually ran for president, but was always considered to be a possible presidential candidate. Having a military background, but also being Secretary of State and also Secretary of Defense. So one of these things that to be able to have that on your resume definitely is something that adds to your presidential credentials. Secretary of Treasury. The first Secretary of Treasury was actually Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was our first Secretary of Treasury. So what does Secretary of Treasury do? They oversee the production of coins and currency, the disbursement of payments to the public, revenue collection, and funds to run the federal government. So again, Alexander Hamilton, who's featured on the $10 bill, he was our first Secretary of Treasury. And one Secretary of Treasury that actually highlights the idea that the interests of the president may not be the same as the interests of the secretary. Paul O'Neill was actually the individual that was selected to be the Secretary of Treasury under President George W. Bush's administration. But Paul O'Neill didn't see eye to eye with the president in terms of his stance with tax cuts. And so he was vocal in his opposition, and he was eventually fired for not necessarily insubordinate, but basically not following the line of the administration. So, a cabinet member, they generally are not going to see eye to eye on every matter. Now, are they going to be loyal to the president? Yeah, oftentimes, most of the time they will, but again, depending on the goals. You have a goal of running a department versus advising the president, and a lot of the times they're very commonly aligned, but sometimes they are not. So cabinet members definitely can be a little bit more vocal in their opposition, again, compared to the White House office. Timothy Geithner, he was the first Secretary of Treasury under Obama's administration. He actually ran into a little problems during the Senate confirmation hearings because he had failed to pay Social Security taxes on some of his earnings, and it was kind of an interesting situation because an individual who basically was the head of the IRS basically did not correctly understand certain tax laws. Now, he ended up paying the taxes that he owed, but again, it kind of showed you the idea that these bureaucracies, there's a lot of red tape, and it's one of the common complaints about bureaucracy, all the red tape and not knowing these certain rules and regulations. And how can an average individual navigate the bureaucracy like the IRS when even the individual who was appointed to head the Department of Treasury and therefore the IRS couldn't even do so. So there are valid complaints about the structure and organization of the bureaucracy. And then you had you have the Secretary of Defense, which originally was actually not called that, but it's kind of morphed into that cabinet position. So originally it was actually the Department of War, but that really sounds too much like you're trying to fight, start something. So it was actually combined with the Department of combined with Navy in 1947, and basically it's the Department of Defense. Basically, they manage the armed forces and operates military bases. Again, Obama tapped Chuck Hagel, a Republican, to head the Department of Defense, maybe as a way to throw an olive leaf across the aisle, to try to use foreign policy as a bipartisan issue. And another thing that's kind of interesting, Donald Rumsfeld was Secretary of Treasury, or not Treasury, of Defense under Gerald Ford in 1974, 1977, and he was the youngest Secretary of Defense at the time. And simultaneously, he was appointed by Bush Jr. During his term as president, and he was also the oldest. He was the oldest Secretary of Defense. So I thought that's kind of an interesting distinction, to have been the youngest and then to have been the oldest. So the time span in which he served 2 different tenures at the Defense Department was nearly 30 years. And also Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney served as the Secretary of Defense under the first George Bush's administration, and then later became the vice president under the second George Bush's administration. So a lot of these positions with the state, treasury, and defense, they're very prominent roles, and they have a lot of influence. And again, there's no prerequisites, no constitutional prerequisites for a lot of these positions. But again, most of these individuals, particularly defense, they're gonna have had military experience or congressional experience for the most part. But there are no formal requirements for these cabinet level positions. Now, what are some other executive departments? You have the Secretary of Interior. What do? They manage federal lands, refuges, and parks. Department of Justice. Again, they provide legal advice, enforce federal laws, and represent the U.S. in courts. And there are others. So there's Agriculture, Commerce, Labor. What they do is they every Friday, one of the goals of, or one of the duties of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, which falls under labor, they report government data on unemployment, inflation, and such figures. Health and Human Services take on a prominent role with Obamacare. Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, they provide a lot of they oversee a lot of regulations and provide subsidized housing for individuals on low income. So they provide a lot of regulations for companies to maintain. Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. So there's a total of 15 departments, cabinet level departments currently in the United States. Now, one kind of interesting fact here, yeah, again, as far as the AP exam is concerned, you're not gonna get a whole lot of questions on the specifics of each cabinet level administration. In fact, one of the questions is not going to be how many cabinet level positions are there. It is good to know the roles of the prominent cabinet level departments, and again, it's not necessary to know specific individuals. That being said, one of the interesting things that has kind of developed as tradition over time is that when the State of the Union address is given at the end of January or beginning of February, again, the president is required by the Constitution to give a State of the Union address. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be televised, but that's what it has become over the years. You have a very potentially dangerous situation. You have the President of the United States addressing the nation, and right behind the President, you have the Vice President of the United States, and right next to the Vice President, you have the Speaker of the House. So you have the first in line to the presidency, and you have the second in line to the presidency, and the president is addressing both houses of Congress. A lot of the cabinet members will attend, and you have the judiciary. So you have you have heads of each, the legislative, executive, and judicial branch, all in one building. So it's a huge security risk. As such, what they will do is they'll do the following. So every year, during the president's State of the Union address, one lower level cabinet member does not attend the speech, just in case something happens and security protocol goes awry and you no longer have the president or Congress. You have a cabinet member, I don't know specifically, maybe like the 15th or 16th down in the line of presidency, after the president, vice president, speaker of the House, president pro tempore. After you keep on going down to the line of lower level cabinet members, you hit upon an individual that basically could become the president of the United States in the case of a terrorist attack of some sort. So kind of interesting. We would have had our first Asian American president if that were the case. On February 12th, 2013, it was Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu that was chosen to be whisked away by the Secret Service. Again, usually a kind of very interesting experience for that cabinet member. It was towards the end of his position. So again, he decided, something that would be kind of interesting. Didn't have to watch the President's State of the Union address live. And then the following year, January 28th of 2014, Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz, he was the chosen individual just in case. So it's one of the kind of the random things that's kind of interesting about these lower level cabinet officials, whether it's going to be the Secretary of Energy or Veterans Affairs or Housing and Urban Development. Usually that individual is whisked away just in case the unthinkable happens. So what are some common problems with the bureaucracy? Again, this has been talked about, but it's this idea of red tape. It creates just too many rules and procedures that slow down the process, especially during periods of divided government. So when you have a Republican Congress and you have a Democrat president or vice versa, it's tough enough to get things done. And the problem with bureaucratic organizations is that because it's run by the federal government, not only do you have different priorities with different political parties, but you have the added layer of red tape. So it can get a little frustrating, and that's probably the major complaint that people have with bureaucracy. And again, with that, you're going to get duplication and conflict. That creates redundancy and inefficiency. And just the nature of bureaucracy, it's just easier to block action than to take action. And people are frustrated when things don't get done. Well, it's kind of built into the system. Things don't get done because the way that bureaucracies are organized, having to deal with the presidency, Congress, and figuring this and that, it's easier to stop things from happening than it is to actually proactively get things done. And again, bureaucrats are difficult to fire. So rather than deal with the cumbersome process, many are allowed to just stay in their position because of the difficulty in firing individuals working for the federal government. Sometimes it's just simply better to try to get that person to retire, or again, it's not structured like the private sector where there's necessarily a bottom line in terms of profit. So sometimes it's, again, easier not to directly fire, but just kind of hide incompetent individuals. Again, because the Constitution stays silent on the issue of bureaucracy, it's up to both the President, Congress, and also individual agencies to collectively decide how to enact public policy. And again, that being the case, there's a lot of individuals that have some say in what these bureaucracies can do. And again, the bureaucratic organizations themselves, they have a lot of discretionary power. And again, their incentives might not be completely aligned with that of the presidency or Congress. So that's just one of the realities of the bureaucracy. So that being said, here, let's go to some examples here. Which of the following is not considered to be part of the executive office of the president? So let's see which ones are part of the executive office of the presidency. National Security Council, absolutely. White House office, absolutely. The OMB, which is one of the few positions within the EOP that is subject to Senate confirmation, absolutely. Council of Economic Advisors, absolutely. State Department, that is absolutely incorrect, and therefore it is the correct answer. State Department. The State Department is a cabinet level position, and again, their interests are going to not necessarily be aligned with that of the president. Okay, question number 2, example number 2. Which of the following individuals is most likely to serve the interests of the president as his or her first priority? So who's going to serve the president of the United States? Is it going to be the White House Chief of Staff? Absolutely. Okay, one of the more recent White House Chief of Staff who actually left to become mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel. And he was known as being someone that ran a tight ship. And originally when Obama selected him, Obama was seen someone as not, as kind of a relatively new politician. So choosing Rahm Emanuel, who's nicknamed Rambo for good reason, someone who would organize the office and maybe do a lot of the dirty work that's sometimes required in politics. So again, the White House Chief of Staff, that person's first priority is going to, at least publicly, is going to be to serve the President of the United States. Not necessarily the Secretary of State, nor the Secretary of Treasury, nor the Secretary of Defense, and not necessarily the Federal Reserve Chairman. Again, all these individuals are not going to necessarily openly sabotage the presidency, but again, their interests are of trying to protect the president is not necessarily going to be their first instinct. Okay, third example. Which of the following cabinet positions was the most recently created in 2012? And this one's fairly straightforward question here. Not state, defense, or treasury. Those are the first three. So choosing between Homeland Security or education. Education was created later on, and actually it was a department that Reagan actually proposed to eliminate because it was created in the 70s, but that never really gained any traction. So there is some federal influence on education policy in the United States, and it runs through the Secretary of Education. But the most recent cabinet level position was Secretary of Homeland Security, which coordinates now the FBI, CIA, a lot of these organizations under one secretary. The problem that that was encountered in the events leading up to the September 11th attacks in 2001 was that a lot of these agencies, the CIA, the FBI, they weren't working together. So there was a push in Congress to create a new cabinet level position to address that need. Okay, example number 4. All the following accurately describe the usual relationship between the president and cabinet heads except. Okay, so what describes this, the usual relationship here? The department secretaries act independently from the president. And that's absolutely the case, so that's not the answer. They do act independently. Because again, not only are they appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, but now they're basically almost like the CEO of the organization. A huge bureaucracy to navigate. So you're leaving your imprint on the organization, and you want to be successful independently of the president. Yeah. Cabinet members spend the majority of the time managing and leading their own departmental business. Absolutely. Just like the president is in charge of his own office and cabinet members, the cabinet heads, they're in charge of creating policy and protocol and building morale within the own department. Cabinet members seek to promote their own departments in cabinet meetings. Absolutely. There's a finite amount of resources, and each cabinet member is probably going to lobby for increased budget spending for his or her department. Cabinet members can sometimes seek their interests at the expense of the administration's interests. Absolutely. You're going to see a lot more public displays of disloyalty with cabinet members than you are with the chief of staff, for example. It's just the nature of the position. And then cabinet members are required to implement the president's policy decisions. Not required. Obviously, you were appointed by the president and your job is to implement the policies, but it's not necessarily the case. The cabinet members are given a lot of discretionary authority in how they're going to enact certain policies. Now, again, the president can ask for your resignation, in essence, fire you, and so the president has the right to do that, but certainly cabinet members are not required to follow 100% of what the president has decided to do. And the final example here is this here. Which of the following statements is true in regards to the bureaucracy? Well, let's take a look here. Most agencies' functions do not overlap with those of other agencies. No, that's absolutely not true. Federal agencies and local and state, they work together. Again, there's some redundancies, but they'll cooperate with one another. Agencies have a high degree of discretionary power to make decisions regarding implementation of policy. Absolutely. This is the correct answer. Again, bureaucracies, they have power because as civil servants, they maintain their positions, and they're going to see different administrations come and go. But a lot of these agencies, they have a lot of discretion in how they're going to exercise these congressional mandates and executive orders. Most agencies do not work with related agencies in state and local government. That is incorrect. They do work with agencies. The bureaucracy is controlled solely by the president. That is not the case. The president has a huge say, especially in appointment powers, but there's a lot of divided powers as well. The bureaucracy is controlled solely by Congress. And again, that's not the case. President and Congress, they both work together in controlling different aspects of the bureaucracy. Thank you for watching educator.com.